Hello and welcome to today's training webinar in starting your ISO 27001 risk assessment. My name is Gary and I'm going to be walking you through today's training session, which will involve our vsRisk cloud solution, which assists organisations start a risk assessment or to continue an ongoing project. Today's discussion, we're going to be covering off an introduction to vsRisk cloud, risk assessment creation, asset-based risk assessments, control reviews, and finally reports, risk treatment plans, and your statement of applicability. Let's start with the introduction. vsRisk is an information security assessment tool created by ISO 27001 experts, and it allows you to conduct an information security risk assessment quickly and easily. The system itself is fully aligned with ISO 27001-2013 and will come in a standalone desktop version, our cloud solution, and it's all built in order to help businesses of all sizes conduct an information security risk assessment with ease. Risk assessment creation. vsRisk Cloud features the ability to scope and define the bounds of a risk assessment. You can create multiple risk assessments, of which I will demonstrate in just a moment, each of which will be subject to a different risk assessment criteria. This system comes packaged with an unlimited amount of assessments, a customized asset library, and the ability to upload and update threats and vulnerability combinations aligned with ISO 27001. Asset-based risk assessments. vsRisk Cloud is built to deliver simple, fast, accurate, and hassle-free risk assessments. It will produce consistent, robust, and reliable assessments year after year with the ability to conduct the asset-based assessment, which is seen to be the more thorough of the two methods. Faster risk assessments essentially cut the time to produce an ISO 27000 risk assessment by as much as 80% compared to using spreadsheets. We built the system to have an easy-to-use interface, a cloud-based software tool with an intuitive interface accessible by multiple users. Simplified risk assessments. To establish a risk assessment framework, the system is able to identify risks, analyze risks, evaluate risks, and select risk management options. We have walkthrough tutorials, which we will demonstrate in a little bit more detail throughout the demonstration. The Risk Assessment Wizard walks users through each step of identifying, evaluating, and responding to an asset-based risk assessment. Identifying the risks by selecting assets, threats and vulnerabilities, and applying the appropriate controls where required to reduce the risk to an acceptable level. The enhanced reporting allows you to generate audit-ready reports, the statement of applicability, and a risk treatment plan to meet the requirements of ISO 27001. Control reviews. Inside the Compliance Manager section of vsRisk, you are able to check and view the controls that have been selected as a result of the risk assessment. You are able to exclude controls or indicate further controls that have been implemented. You are then able to satisfy your contractual, business, statutory, regulatory, and legal requirements. All of this data is then entered in the controls viewer and then incorporated into the SOA or Statement of Applicability. Reports. This is where we're going to cover the risk treatment plan and the statement of applicability. The reports will give you a comprehensive overview of the current state of your risk assessment and treatment process. The two reports the system is able to produce are your statement of applicability and your risk treatment plan, as you may or may not be aware are mandatory parts or requirements of the ISO 27001 certification. Reports from within inside the system can be printed or exported as a PDF copy for electronic download. Okay, let's get started with the tool. The system itself is hosted on our CyberComply platform. The CyberComply platform is a cloud solution which is accessible by any modern browser and is accessible instantly up to 5 individual administrators. The system itself has a number of settings built in to help customize your experience within the platform, and we can do so by selecting at the top right hand corner where you're able to request assistance, overview your own user details including modifying your password, username and business details, your account summary, which is where you're able to administer new users or update existing users' information, including accessibility rights. We have settings, and lastly, log out. We're going to be going into vsRisk Cloud now, where we are going to have a short overview of examples that I have already produced, and we're then going to take you through the aforementioned risk treatment wizard, in which is an 8-step walkthrough to create the risk, apply your controls, or set an appropriate response, and then finalize the risk. As we can see over here on the left hand side, I already have one that's been completed. By selecting on Vigilant, which is my risk assessment group, we can see that we currently have 2 assessments being conducted. To create a new group, select Create New at the top left, and this will take you through 2 simple stages in where you'll need to name the assessment, modify your likelihood and impact scales, enter additional context, and then finalize on your risk criteria. Once we have entered in the assessment name, we can now move through into our impact and likelihood scales, which could be modified to either meet your current setup or to obviously set up based on a new project. The scales can be modified by using the arrow keys either side of the scroll bar, and if we need to add additional context to these, we can do by selecting here, give the title, and then enter in additional information. We are also able to edit the terminology that is used on the scale, ranging from highly unlikely to highly likely, again to either meet something you've already been conducting or based on previous experience or consultation. Scrolling down, we move into your impact scales. Again, we have the same ability to modify the scale from very low to very high, and underneath we are then measuring the impact against confidentiality, integrity, and availability. Each one of these have already been populated for you. Alternatively, again, these are customizable with free text, so it's entirely up to you what you enter in here. At the bottom here, in addition to the 3 that we provide, you may wish to add additional context such as financial impact or reputational. Once we are happy at this stage, we can now select Next, and it moves us into our risk criteria. The 3 that the system will offer you will be broadly acceptable, tolerable, and intolerable. To the right hand side, you will see to edit values, and to do so, simply select the new range in which you wish that to cover. Once we're happy, select OK, and now choose Save. We can now see that the new risk assessment group has been selected down the bottom here, and at the moment it's showing that no risks are being conducted underneath this assessment type. To add a new risk, we select on the 3-bar line here and choose Add, and we now enter into the 8-stage wizard that we mentioned earlier. The first section on here is going to be using your asset library. There are 2 ways to populate this area. There is an asset library built into CyberComply where you can either import from a pre-existing asset registry from an Excel document, or you go through and create them one by one. We will illustrate how you do this later on. The example we're going to be using today is advisor mobile devices. It's a very common situation in most businesses, and they're quite susceptible to things like theft and loss, which is the example we're going to use today. At the top here we have a searchability, so if you are working with a large asset library, it helps you navigate through this with ease. We can now proceed on into selecting our threats. The threats that you see on screen are already pre-populated, and to search we simply type at the top here. The example we're going to be using is theft and loss of an asset, and we now proceed on into the vulnerability. At the top here, we're going to use the searchability, and this will find any keywords within a particular vulnerability that matches security. The example we're going to be using is something like inadequate security awareness and training for our staff. Selecting on this will bring it to the very top, and we can now proceed. Before we move on, you do now have the ability to save and close, and the purpose of this is if you need to assign a task to that actual asset owner for them to then go through and assess the initial risk, set the response controls, review the residual risk, and then finalize for themselves. We're going to continue on, and we're now going to assess the initial risk. Now the example we're using are advisor mobile devices. Therefore, the impact on the business should a theft or loss of this asset occur is not actually going to be too high, but the likelihood is going to be somewhere in the region of a 3 by 3. Over here on the right hand side, it's now going to be referencing the context you would have completed during the risk assessment creation, where we can see the general likelihood is plausible and the impact is medium, with an extensive amount of non-sensitive data being disclosed, an extensive amount of data slightly corrupted, and finally primary services minimally interrupted. We're now going to continue on into setting our response. At the top here, we have the ability to insert a justification as to why we've chosen what we have below. And then below there we have the 4 options to choose from: retain, or to modify, share, or avoid. Each one has a description as to what it is trying to illustrate, and anybody that is familiar with risk assessments, this is also known as the 4 T's: treat, terminate, tolerate, and transfer. The option we're going to be choosing today is modify, so we are actually going to be taking steps to reduce or eliminate the risk's impact and or likelihood by implementing a cost-effective control. Selecting here, we're now going to move into choosing from our control selections. The system itself will give you access to ISO 27001, both 2005 and its successor 2013. And paired with the compliance manager, you're then able to upload your own internal controls or access a wider range of control sets such as NIST or PCI. At the top here, we are now greeted again by the search ability, and we're going to be using one control, but to make you aware, you do have the ability to use more than one control during the assessment stage. The control that we're going to be using today is ISO's 27001 Section A 7.2.2 Information Security Awareness, Education and Training, more commonly known as e-learning, and it's quite a common practice across businesses when they're issuing new products or new tools to their staff that they go through the relevant training in order to either understand how it's used or to give them security awareness in our case to ensure that they're locking their devices or keeping them secure when they're outside the building. Once we've chosen our control, as I mentioned, you can add more than one, but we're just using one for today's example. We now move on into reviewing your residual risk. Now again, this is what I mentioned earlier, that it's either advised that the asset owner is completing these stages or that you have assigned the task to that individual. So here we're now going to be using that same risk criteria scoring system that we set up at the very beginning, and we're going to now be saying that the likelihood has now been reduced, not by much, but it has been reduced, but the impact is going to remain the same. Essentially the data that is stored on these devices is the same, and obviously all we're trying to mitigate here is the likelihood. What you'll be able to see now is that we've now moved that risk into a more tolerable area as opposed to being completely intolerable as a business standpoint. We now come on to the last stage in the risk assessment, and this is where we finalise the risk. At the top here, we assign the risk owner, and below we are then able to add additional messages or comments. We can add a comment in here. This is for internal use only and will not show up on any internal report or external report, and you also have the ability to reference a file at this stage as well. Now that we've completed the 8 stages of the risk wizard, we now hit save and close, and this will return us back to this screen here. We're now going to deselect these to remove them from the focal point and expand only the new risk that we've now populated. Navigating to the center part of the screen, we can expand the risk summary, where we're able to see an overview of the initial risk, the response that we've taken, the residual risk, and who the owner of that risk is as well. Below, at the bottom, we have 8 additional tabs which will either self-populate or you're able to add additional context to. The first one is to show what controls we're actually using to help mitigate this risk. We can see here that we're using 7.2.2, and selecting on the I button next to it, we will be greeted with a pop-up screen which will give you a breakdown or a requirement of that control, its reference, its status, and we're also now able to mark our implementation status of that individual control set. We'll cover this in more detail a little bit later. The next area along is where we can show relationships with legal requirements. Maybe that's the EU GDPR or separate regulations that you may have chosen to upload into the tool. To add the requirements, we select here. We'll be greeted with a pop-up window which will give us access into our UK laws and also the EU GDPR articles. And again, like I mentioned, you're then able to view any custom sets that you may have uploaded as well. The next tab along is where we can show related tasks. We alluded to this earlier where you are able to, or it may be advised to save and close at certain points during the risk assessment. Once you do that, you're then advised to set a task to the relevant owner, be that the risk owner or the asset owner. Creating a task is very simple. Select Create Task here, choose from one of the other users of the platform, assign the deadline date, and then finally any additional information as well as hyperlinks. The next tab along is where we tie into our data flow mapping tool, of which we have a separate training session on if you wish to join that. The following tab is where we can see additional comments, messages, and it's also a nice way of keeping track of what has been modified or changed on the assessment itself. This will keep track of things such as dates that items were modified, who made that change, and what the change was. We then move on into related assets. So this is a self-populating screen. If we select the I button on the asset, we get a quick overview and a pop-up screen that will give us the asset type, who the operator of it is, and finally its location. From here, you're able to jump into your asset library and make a modification to this if that's required. The last two we have on here is going to be related records. Again, this ties in with our data flow mapping tool and DPIA sections. And then lastly, if we want to show associations or relationships with any other risks across the business, you're able to do so at this section by selecting Add Risk, and we can access all of them underneath this section. At the top right hand corner, we have some additional icons. The first one is the ability to edit the risk over time, and again this will be recorded under the message or audit trail. We have the ability to close all but this one if we have multiple open at one time. We can close or minimize it back to its group, or we can simply delete the risk where you'll be asked to confirm that action. Above there we have the option to run an individual risk report, where this will simply highlight or feedback or break down each one of these tabs into a nice tabled format. Once we've now completed all of the risk assessments, you're then going to be required to run a risk treatment plan. Selecting on the paperboard icon here, we then get the report, which is seen as the risk treatment plan at the top here, your ISMS name, in which mine is seen as Vigilant Demo Gary. We have an issue date, so it's a nice way of keeping track as to when reports were run for when you come to reassess them in 3, 6, 9 months further on down the line. And now we have a breakdown of everything that is contained within this particular group. We can see the asset type, the threat, vulnerability, finally the response and owner, and the controls that we're using. We can see here that we've already marked this as implemented. We would also be able to see if we'd assigned tasks, and finally the deadline on there as well. We'll show you this in a little bit more detail. From here, you then have the ability to print or export, as you will find within most modern browsers. Okay, now that we have finished conducting the risk assessment, we're now going to be moving on into the control review selection. Using the top foremost section at the top here, hovering over this will give you a drop-down menu. The area that we're going to be focusing on are your ISMS controls. Dropping down here, we'll have access to CES, ISO, NIST, organisation controls, and PCI DSS. The focal point for today's presentation is 27001, and this will take us into all 114 controls within Annex A of 27001-2013. Along the top here, we have search functions, where we can narrow down this search to show only excluded controls, not considered, selected and planned, or selected and implemented. The next tab along will give you a quick dashboard overview to highlight how much of the control set we're currently not considering, excluding, selected, planned, or selected and implemented. Throughout the tool itself, you may have noticed these bulb icons, and they simply give you help and tip sections related to the particular page you're looking at. Lastly on here, we have the option to select all, which will then bring them all into view in the middle section here. We are now going to scroll down and select on the control that we know that we have just used, which is 7.2.2 Information Security Awareness, Education and Training. By selecting on this control, we now bring it into view in the main section where we can expand and view the requirement once again. We're able to see any implementation guidance if we're able to offer any. We have the status of the control, its effective from and to dates, and again access to each one of these 8 tabs down the bottom here. We're not going to go through each one individually, but just to highlight some nice areas that you might find helpful, we have related legal requirements, which is something our compliance team has gone through and done for our users. For example, if we are looking at 7.2 during employment, we have shown the relationships with a number of UK laws as well as certain articles within the EU GDPR. We again have the ability to leave tasks, related processes. We have a more in-depth audit trail message board, again just highlighting when modifications are made and what the change was. Related assets, records, and this last section is something again that will self-populate, where now it's highlighting every single risk we have across our business, whether it's a privacy risk or an asset risk related or using the 7.2 during employment control set. From here, we can quickly jump back into a risk assessment to make a small modification. We do so by selecting the I button and selecting Open Risk here. Lastly, a requirement that you'll need to go through is obviously marking your status, whether you are not considering that control, whether you're selecting and planning, selecting and implementing, or excluding not applicable. The only reason the last option should be chosen is, for example, if we look at the control that is related to off-site or third-party software development, you might not have that as a particular part of your business model, therefore you're then able to select excluded or not applicable. If we were to choose selected and planned, you will be automatically prompted by the system to set a task, and we'll go through organisation tasks in just a moment. At the bottom here, we're then able to modify the reason for selecting this particular control. The system as a default will automatically understand that you're using these controls as part of a risk assessment, but as we mentioned earlier in our slides, if we select edit on here, we're then able to add additional context such as, is the reason for selection a business requirement, contractual, statutory or regulatory requirement. At the bottom here, you're then able to add additional notes and comments which will then appear on or inside your statement of applicability. Once we've repeated this action over and over throughout the rest of the control set, the last thing you are then to do is to run a statement of applicability, another compulsory report of the ISO 27001 certification. We do so by selecting the starred icon paper at the top here. This will take a matter of seconds to load, and once it has done so, it will highlight what the report is trying to illustrate, again your ISMS name, the issued date, and then finally a breakdown of the controls to show your implementation status of each individual one. If we scroll down to 7.2.2, the example we have used today, Information Security Awareness, Education and Training, again we get an overview as to what the requirement is, whether it has been selected and planned or implemented, and then finally the risk selection down the bottom here. From here, the statement of applicability again has that option to either print or export into PDF for a digital download. Okay, we're now going to move on into other smaller areas of the system that you may find useful, and will also give you some additional information and context to the assessment in general. Coming to the top left hand corner, we're now going to have a quick overview of the asset library. This is the area that will be shared amongst the rest of the tool, so if you do use things such as the data flow mapping tool, the DPIA or the compliance manager, they all share the same library, making it very quick and easy to use multiple assets across multiple parts of the system. The one we're going to be selecting is Advisor Mobile Devices, and here again, to keep nice and conformed, we have the same 8 tabs, some of them self-populating, some of them where you can add additional context. As we're looking at a risk assessment today, what we're going to do is expand this area to show related risks, and from an asset standpoint, we're now able to see straight away what risks apply to that individual piece of information or asset. To create the library, it's very simple. we select the Create New at the top left-hand corner, where we're able to enter in information such as the asset type. We can then reference it, which is essentially its naming criteria, its operator, whether it is seen as a controller of information or if it is a processor, joint processor, etc. And this is again because it's a shared asset library to give you additional information when dealing with data flow maps. We can then outline the owner of this particular asset, and then finally its location, where inside the settings menu you're able to upload custom locations as well. You are also able to import assets in a bulk format. You can either do this by downloading our Excel template and then populating it with an existing registry, or simply just dragging and dropping your existing one straight into the system for it to identify and then lay out as we've already seen so far. Asset creation is very quick and simple, and even large imports can take a matter of seconds, all the way up to 200-300 assets that we've seen before. Again, we're now going to come to the top left-hand corner and hovering to move into a separate section of the system which users may find useful when trying to administer the risk assessment or to ensure that tasks are being completed on time. We're now going to enter into tasks, and this will give us a long list of every single task that has been assigned, who they are assigned to, and their status. We can select all here to bring it into the main point view in just a second. And what we're able to see is who the owner of the task is, what the task content was, when it was due. This can be modified at the top here or deleted, and we're also able to mark if it's been completed or not. If we scroll down, we have a number of overdue ones, and again, just to highlight that point, we can mark as complete, select OK, and it will change the status, and it will clear it from the overdue status page over here on the left hand side. Within this area, you're able to run a quick report which you may wish to then distribute across the key stakeholders within the project itself. Selecting print here, we have a list of all of the tasks, and scrolling down we then have the additional information that we may have given each one, including any clauses, processes, tasks, assets, records and risks. Okay, that brings us to the end of today's training session. Of course, we will always welcome anybody viewing this video to get in touch via our website. You can email us, contact us using the phone number, email on screen, or join us on LinkedIn, Twitter, or Facebook. And of course, we would always welcome any additional comments in the comment section below. Thank you very much for your time today, and we look forward to hearing from you shortly.